From KCRW in Santa Monica, this is The Treatment.
Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. You can also hear the show at KCRW.com. In the 10 years since he's been making features, writer-director Chris Nolan has been making films in which the protagonist's emotional chaos is mirrored in the physical world around him, starting with, following to his newest film, the second Batman film, The Dark Knight. Chris, first of all, thanks so much for coming back to do the show again.
Thank you.
But it really is interesting that kind of emotional and psychological chaos that the protagonists are all experiencing ends up being a really big part of the physical world around them.
Well, I think particularly when you're dealing with an iconic character, superhero character like Batman, there's a very direct relationship between the physicality of the character, the iconography of the character, and the internal state, the emotional state of the character. And I think that's one of the reasons I've enjoyed doing these films. You get to create something on a very operatic scale. The audience has associations with the character coming into the movie. They know who this character is and what he represents. So you get to tell a story on a very grand scale.
But there's also, in this film, more than any other film you've done, there's definitely a causal effect between the character's psychological distress and that world around him.
The interesting thing about Batman as a figure is that he's driven by very, very dark things. There's a lot of rage, a lot of anger that really, really motivates him, but he's trying to channel that into something good. But he's really playing with fire. He's working outside the law. He's doing all kinds of very questionable things, but in the service of good. And that really is playing with fire. That really is riding this knife edge. So what we do in the Dark Knight is we just sort of test that, and we test it using the character of the Joker, who's this extraordinary force of anarchy, and somebody who just lives and delights in taking people's rule sets and turning them, against themselves. It seemed sort of the ideal way to get to the core of Batman and the paradox of Batman, because he's somebody who's essentially doing bad things for good reason. He's using, force and vigilantism and intimidation, but he's trying to do it in the service of good. And I think it's an interesting place to have your hero.
But it's also explicitly said in the film that, the Joker is in fact the force of evil. He is more or less unleashed. He kind of rises to the challenge of Batman, doesn't he?
I think he does. The scene at the end of Batman Begins where Gordon talks about the concept of escalation. He basically says to Batman, you've created this force against crime. What do you think is going to happen next? And that was really the hook that got me interested in continuing the story. I wanted to see, what that criminal response would be. It's very much personified by the presence of the Joker and the way in which the conventional mobsters of Gotham unleash the Joker, really. I think is kind of similar to the way Bruce Wayne, channels his darkest impulses into the figure of Batman. And so what you wind up with in this film is these two very distinct, iconic figures, a force of evil, a force of good, going up against each other.
But there's this kind of plea almost from the Joker to Batman to tell him to enjoy what it is he has to offer because he knows what he is.
I think the Joker understands Batman, or feels he understands Batman, possibly in a way that Bruce Wayne doesn't entirely understand himself. And I think in the interrogation scene in the middle of the film between the Joker and Batman, it's interesting to see how the Joker is able to get under his skin. We like to think of our heroes, our heroic figures, as being immune to those kind of mind games. But of course, we all know that Batman is the most tortured and psychologically unbalanced in a way of these heroes. And so he's very vulnerable to the threat that the Joker poses, and we try and continually remind the audience of that during the course of the film.
It's the truth. My guest is writer-director Christopher Nolan. His new film in his series of Pandora's Box films is The Dark Knight. But just going even back to Following, where a character walks into a a tableau that he essentially sets into motion through his own less than, let's say, decent impulses. That's something that's a strain that's really run through the films. And I wonder where that comes from for you, just the idea of a protagonist who is, in effect, really not heroic, unlocking these darker forces.
Well, I think for me it comes from my interest in film noir and what sort of defines that. Not for me being so much the visual style, but the form of characterization that you get in those great stories. The idea that character is defined through action. Very often these films are centered around a protagonist who's either an unreliable narrator, which is what we played with very much in Memento, or simply someone who has some flaw in them, some tragic flaw that early on there's an indicator in the story that this is going to snowball into something catastrophic. And in The Dark Knight, I found a lot of interest in the character of Harvey Dent for myself. He's a very heroic figure at the beginning. He's the guy that Bruce Wayne sees as being able to take over for him. He's a hero without a mask. He's a positive figure for Gotham to rally behind, who can take over for Batman. But in the way that Aaron Eckhart plays him, there's something right from the beginning you see in him that's questionable. You see a sort of vaulting ambition. You see a little germ of darkness there that can, and of course therefore will, in this kind of story, rise up and turn into something ugly.
But the great thing you do, and I think it really follows through from, I think in some ways from Memento to The Dark Knight, is having so much of this horror play out in broad daylight.
Well, particularly in The Dark Knight, we felt that, if Batman now, rules the night in Gotham, daytime is going to be the more threatening aspect because the Joker rules the day, essentially. We in our telling of this story, we've never felt that Bruce Wayne could ever go out as Batman in daylight, that, the costume would appear ridiculous to the other characters. It wouldn't be threatening without the cover of darkness. So we've always sort of treated him a bit like Dracula or something. The actual Batman himself can only come out after dark. For that reason, a lot of our most threatening scenes in The Dark Knight we chose to have in broad daylight, as you say. I think when you turn the lights on, and in the interrogation scene, for example, in the middle of the film, we tried to really invert expectations and begin very, very dark and have people think that's how the scene will play out. But then we actually went incredibly bright with the whole scene, because when you're in broad daylight, when the sun is out, when the lights are on, I think in cinematic terms, you're not pushing the audience one way or the other. You're not cluing them into where the scene is going to go. And there's an interestingly unpredictable sense that helps. And there's also, at times, a certain bleakness that evokes that I think can get under the skin a little more effectively.
But I found it to be really intriguing because it really does play against all of the Batman mythos, and it's also a way that the Joker really understands what this is. And it really is as much a psychological battle as it is a physical battle, isn't it?
I think it's very much a psychological battle. And then the physicality of the movie, which I don't know, some people are getting... I hope people sort of figure it out, is that, we blow up an enormous amount of things in the film. But there is a reason for it. And the reason is, and we went into it knowing that if you can show a scale of destruction and random, terrifying destruction that the character of the Joker is prepared to unleash, and if you can continually kind of hammer this with the audience over the course of the story, you reach a point where you really don't know what's possible, what's not possible, what's allowed in this story and what's not allowed in this story. And I think that makes the Joker become a very, very unpredictable character. I think at times you really do feel he's prepared to do absolutely anything. So that the physicality of the story is all geared towards getting to a point near the end of the movie where you're actually concerned that the whole city will go down. You're actually concerned that this guy is going to completely destabilize that society.
The master of chaos we're talking to is Christopher Nolan. His new film as director is The Dark Knight. I was fascinated, too, and this is something you never see in a big-budget action film, is that there's no explanation given for the Joker, which actually makes sense because there's no way you could really explain a character like that, is there? And it makes him really actually more threatening because of that.
I think you feel that the Joker has a drive to tear the world down. The line we gave Alfred to sort of sum it up really is, this idea that some men just want to watch the world burn. And that to us was the most frightening way of approaching the character, that he isn't someone who can be in any way negotiated with in a material sense or a legal sense or a political sense. He is just somebody who wants to tear everything down around him. And really it's sort of, comes back to very elemental things like society's sort of fear of youth and teenagers and rebellion and punk and all of these things. And these are all things we talked about a lot in putting the character together at the very beginning. My brother Jonah, who co-wrote the screenplay with me, and David Goyer and myself came up with the story. But for us, one of, I think, society's most palpable fears is the fear of the collapse to anarchy, the idea of people in society who will not in any way be bound by any kind of convention, whether that of society or even the convention of criminal society within the larger society.
But that punk aspect you talk about is really, for me, harkens back to Kubrick's Clockwork Orange.
Well, the character of Alex in A Clockwork Orange, both in the film but also in the novel, is something that Heath and I talked about the first time we ever spoke about the Joker and who he would be, because very much what drives both the film and the novel is the terrifying idea of the absolutely lawless and yet somehow attractive anarchy that teenage rebellion can present, taken to its absolutely most appalling extreme. And we really wanted to get a little bit of that into this idea of who the Joker is. We wanted a very youthful sense to the Joker, a very, as I say, sort of punk sensibility to the Joker. Well,
that manifests itself in Heath Ledger's physical appearance, right down to the makeup, which does look like punk. As a friend of mine said, he almost looks like the world's scariest crack whore in the makeup.
Yeah, I mean, I showed Heath Francis Bacon paintings, sort of looked at these great canvases, the way you'd smear the faces, the paint of the faces, and make these very bizarre, blurred sort of distortions, as if the paint is running on the canvas or smeared across it. And Heath, together with John Caglione, his makeup artist, they really managed to put together a great texture for that, and it degrades through the film. It has a very tactile sense. You can really see the form of the makeup as it's caked on the face. And I like to say that what we were after, and I think what they very much achieved, is in the big close-ups of the Joker, particularly in the IMAX format. I think you can really almost smell his breath.
What's fascinating about this, though, and you make me think about this, is there's a real peacock aspect to both Batman and the Joker. They're both sort of constantly preening. There's a real kind of vanity of appearance in both of these figures, isn't there?
Well, there is, but the danger is that if you ever sort of felt that, I think as you first saw them, the vanity, the peacock aspect, particularly with the Joker, it was very important that we somehow bury that. And the way we did it is, the clothes are flamboyant. We looked to begin with at, could he just not have the purple suit? Could he not have the green hair? Could it be, something more pedestrian, more everyday? And once you strip away those elements of the iconography, it's not the Joker anymore, we found. And so we wound up building back towards this quite flamboyant character. But the way in which we chose to bury it is to have that anti-dandy, if you like, that you get from the sort of punk sensibility, this idea that the clothes are grubby and degraded, as if he wears the same thing the whole time, as if he's been out all night, never takes his clothes off, never washes, and he just sleeps that way and probably smells absolutely appalling. That, to me, was a way of creating the texture of somebody who, in a sense, doesn't care about their appearance, even though, in fact, obviously, there's a great style with which they put themselves together.
We'll take a break. We're talking about, and I never thought we'd get to this, the smell of the Joker with the director-writer of the new film, The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan. I'm Elvis Mitchell. This is The Treatment. More to come.
You're listening to The Treatment with Elvis Mitchell from the studios of KCRW Santa Monica.
Welcome back. It's The Treatment, which you can also hear at KCRW.com. My guest, writer-director Christopher Nolan, has been with us. This is now his fourth time, and it's always good to talk to him. But I want to get back to this aspect of pride that so often turns out to be your protagonist's undoing. And certainly, I think about for me, the linkages between this film and The Prestige, about how pride becomes, masculine pride especially, becomes this gauntlet.
One of the story elements I'm continually drawn to is that the protagonist who suffers, and I think, in a thriller or an action film or whatever, by definition, you're going to test your protagonist. You're going to put somebody through a lot. I think if that comes from inside themselves somehow, if they are somehow responsible for their own predicament, I find that very evocative. I find that very, very much more moving than if it's as simple as, oh, well, here's a bad guy and he's doing bad things. So I think with all the stories I've tried to tell, I've always quite liked having a central character who's in some way responsible for his own situation.
And that's a very noir thing, too, because there's always that pride in noir that leads to the undoing, isn't it?
I mean, pride is an interesting way to describe it. There are other ways to look at it, but it's the feeling of control that we all have. We like to feel that we control our lives, and I think noir very much plays into our secret fear that, in fact, we don't control our lives at all, and other people are all conspiring against us and bringing about our downfall or whatever. But pride's an interesting way to put it, because I think that it's very much a factor in that, because what you constantly see in noir is this, these characters who believe they're controlling their fate. And yet it's very, very obvious to the audience that they're not, and you sort of can't understand why they can't figure that out sooner.
That plot aspect of fate, which is something that's not often a part of big action, certainly of comic book heroes, where it's really that their own fate has doomed them. And that fate is such a big part of this inexorable thing that's pulling Batman into it. And combining that in pride is a unique way to go with this.
Well, I think what we've tried to take advantage of, story-wise, is that we're working with not just great characters that have had this great history, but they're icons. And in being icons for the audience, I think you're able to play out the drama on a very, very grand operatic scale. You're able to play with very, very grand emotions, very large feelings and ideas of fate and destiny that you can employ in a noirish story. But it has to be a very bleak, closed kind of trap that closes in on its characters. With these iconic characters, you get to play with those same inevitabilities, but I think they get to expand outwards. They get to sort of be larger than the world we all live in. And there's something that's really very rewarding about getting to tell a story in that way and try and engage the audience in this very, very grand manner that's very much larger than life, and yet, speaks to our regular human emotions.
I feel like so much of what you do in Dark Knight was unleashed for you in a lot of ways in The Prestige, because I keep thinking again about this pride and what you talked about, that ostensible sense of control that these protagonists are seeking to exert over the other. And that really is carried over to this film for me too, because the similarities are really what cause the friction. And these are both, in a way, both characters between Batman and the Joker that are all id.
There's also a very interesting relationship between Gary Oldman's character and Aaron Eckhart's character in the film. And a lot of what goes on in the story is based on this idea of pride that you're talking about, very much between Gordon and Harvey Dent. Gordon being the one honest cop in Gotham, and Harvey Dent being the new crusading district attorney, but somebody who's made their name through internal affairs. And so Gordon's very distrustful. They're very distrustful of each other. And antagonistic towards each other, but they have to work together. And I think the initial distrust combined with that sense of wanting to control the other, wanting to protect themselves from the actions of the other and influence the actions of the other, that ultimately gets them into a lot of trouble. And I think we've tried to inject the story with the idea right from the beginning so that you immediately feel the antagonism between these guys is going to lead someplace very, very negative. With all of the major story movements of The Dark Knight, we've tried to imbue them with a sense of inevitability. You really want kind of in the first reel to set up a set of expectations and feelings about the type of story that you're going to see and the way in which these things are going to play out for these characters. But hopefully we'll try and surprise people in terms of how those things come to pass.
It's a treatment. I'm talking to a writer-director, Christopher Nolan, about his new film, The Dark Knight. You may detect a bit of an accent that's not either New York or Southern California from him. And it's fascinating, too, that in this film you've got a number of people who aren't Americans playing Americans. It adds this kind of almost ineffable sense of sort of everybody being a little alien, and feeling kind of like an outsider.
Well, it's hard to know how much of that, is present in the film for me, because always with actors, particularly transformative actors like Christian and
Christian
Heath,
Bale and Heath Ledger, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And but Gary Oldman as well. He's just playing a character so different than he is in real life, and than you've seen him in other films. I think to a certain extent these guys are so transformative that they actually bury those expectations. I think that to a certain extent the audience doesn't recognize them from real life or other films. And what's wonderful about that for the storytelling aspect is I think the audience is able to lose themselves in the character.
But as we talk about this, one of the things that struck me about this movie in particular is that given the sense of scale, and there's always lots of people around for the most part, that these people you're mentioning, Oldman and Bale and Ledger and even Michael Caine, they all seem like they're outcasts in this maelstrom that's swirling around them.
Well, I think the force of the Joker, the character, I like to say, sort of cuts through the story like the shark in Jaws. Just he's a force to be reacted to.
And is that how you really conceive of him, as being this physical force, this emotional force that people just react to,
yes,
not from a sense of logic at all?
Well, because he's not acting from a sense of logic, he is effectively a monster in the film. He's a very human monster. I mean, Alfred points out very early on that this is not someone who can be reasoned with in any way or negotiated with or manipulated or controlled. And so as the Joker does things in the story, it tests the characters. It forces them to confront things about themselves. I very much like that in terms of its approach to villainy, because I think that it puts it onto the characters that we already know, particularly the characters from the first film and from the comics and everything. So you're seeing characters that you've come to know forced into very uncomfortable decisions and very paradoxical situations, and it tells you something about those characters. It reveals them in sort of new and interesting ways.
We're talking to writer-director Christopher Nolan. His new film is The Dark Knight, is The Treatment. Well, what fascinates me, too, is we're talking about all this masculine perspective, and really it's about, in some of these cases, with the exception of Alfred, about pride. But the woman, Rachel, played by Maggie Gyllenhaal, is the one character who's not living in the moment. She's thinking about her future, and that's an interesting kind of tension to bring to the story, too, isn't it?
The figure of Rachel carrying over from Batman Begins, it was very important that we had this character who knew Bruce from childhood, and that carries on, into this story, so that you have somebody who, I think, well, she's somebody who understands what he's gone through and why he's doing what he's doing, but has a clear-headed view of it and is more down to earth, is more in touch, I think, with the reality of the situation. And so she's, in a certain kind of way, I think in this film, she takes over a little bit as his conscience. In the first film, I think Alfred was very much, his conscience, if you like. But I think in this film, if you watch what Michael does with the performance, particularly if you have the chance to see the film more than once.
And you're talking about Michael Caine as Alfred.
Michael Caine as Alfred. He's very supportive for Bruce, but as Bruce's drive to be Batman, or to his commitment to this figure that he's created, is tested. It's Alfred who is pushing him back into the arena. It's Alfred who is standing for their original decision to fight crime in Gotham in the way that they chose to. And there's something quite hard about the way he does that. There's something almost a little Machiavellian about it. There's a little sort of Lady Macbeth thing going on there. I mean, he's just driving him, but it's very subtle in the way Michael does it, so that it's still lovable old Alfred, and he's still the great heart of the movie. But if you watch it very closely, there is a sense in which he's actually almost further invested in the Batman character than Bruce Wayne himself.
Well, just to speak of that, too, I mean, there's a beat, I don't want to give too much away, near the end that seems that they could be both kind of altruistic and, I thought, particularly kind of manipulative. I don't want to talk too much about that, but that really seems to get to both sides of the character that you were talking about with Alfred. Yeah,
and I think that, it was always interesting to me to have a slightly ambiguous moment there that, you might watch and feel that it's somehow an ennobling moment. It's an altruistic gesture that Alfred gives at the end. But you might watch it differently. You might not be following that more straightforward emotional journey that's suggested by what Alfred's doing. You might actually be questioning him a little bit more.
Well, for me, though, that moment we're talking about with Alfred is the moment that really feels like noir, because it offers itself as a moment of real ambivalence.
I think it is. It's a very noirish touch, but what's fun is I think you can watch the film in a more straightforward way as well, and it can be an emotional beat. The thing about noir is that it's not in itself necessarily very emotional as a genre, and with those kind of story moves, there's always a danger with noir that it devolves into simple cleverness, if you like, or just with the elaborate nature of the trap and the paradox that the characters are finding themselves in. So the challenge with that type of storytelling is always to try and get the emotion into it. And as I say, when working with these familiar characters who are somewhat larger than life for the audience, but having these great actors who can make them feel very real, I think you get to do a bit of both.
Well, we're out of time, Chris. Thanks again so much for doing this.
Thank you.
My guest is writer-director Christopher Nolan. His new film is The Dark Knight. Our recording engineer at KCRW in Santa Monica is Bob Carlson, with technical assistance from NPR in New York. Bob Carlson is also the editor. Gemma Dempsey's the producer. I'm Elvis Mitchell. It's The Treatment.
An audio archive of this and other programs can be found at kcrw.com. For questions and comments about The Treatment, please email us at thetreatment@kcrw.com. The Treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.